Hi, everybody. I'm Carol Kauffman, the founder of the Institute of Coaching with Margaret Moore and Susan David. And I am here with my good friend, former sort of boss, and just the brilliant Jonathan Donner. And he's written a book on 21st century leadership called Guiding the Tide with co-authors. I'm not sure if I'm going to say these right, Jonathan. Why don't you say the two guys' names?
Frank Guglielmo and
Yes.
Siddhartha Palsul.
You can see why I might not be able to pronounce them. So let me tell you about Jonathan, and sorry to embarrass you, Jonathan. For about 6 or 7 years, I was involved in an authentic leadership gig at Unilever during the years of Paul Pullman. And that was when Jonathan was the head of leadership development, talent, and learning at Unilever, where he then left us all sobbing. And then I think that's when you went off to be a special advisor for the UN World Food Program. And then you were also the head of global executive development at Amazon. So guys, he is quite the experienced leadership development person. And the work at Unilever, actually, Harvard Business School got very excited about it. And it's one of these cases that they teach in the business school. So Jonathan, why don't you just start out and share a bit about your book and all the, it's based on hundreds and hundreds of leaders and on evidence-based and research and really coming up with a new way of developing leaders. So take it away.
Well, thanks, Carol. It's really a privilege to talk to you, especially because you've been on the journey with me as I've learned a lot about leaders, and I'm continually passionate about trying to make a difference. Our goal in the book was really to shift the narrative. We were frustrated with where we left leaders from all the work that I'd done with you and all the work we were seeing in the marketplace. The concept of complexity had kind of overwhelmed everyone, and we began to work with it under the guise of VUCA. And we did a lot of work to help leaders become internally self-aware and develop their purpose and their values. But as the complexity increased, we realized that we weren't giving them enough. We weren't helping them step forward, we were helping them react. So this book was sort of a playbook for how to step forward with agency. And of course, the word agency is quite loaded, but we really wanted to move ahead and create a new S-curve in our work and maybe change the dialogue and shift it a bit.
So talk a little bit about the whole idea of guiding the tide and sort of the whole metaphor about that kind of fluidity, because it's going from agility to fluidity and complexity. Can you talk about that? I love that metaphor.
Right. Well, briefly, you and I came out of a world where we got to describe the world's complexity as VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And it was a great concept that helped us deal with hierarchy and certainty and long-range planning and all these things that were needed to really re-examine. But at the same time, it became comfortable over time, and because it was a description about the fact that stuff happens, and that what we need to do is we need to actually build a theory around agility, which kind of emerged from the software industry, and extremely useful agility. But we became very defensive in our approach, and it was almost like we had a problem in front of us. We developed a whole bunch of very, very important, flexible, agile skills, but we hadn't actually created a model for how to step into it. And then we thought, well, what is it? And it was much more complex than that. I mean, we define the tide as kind of the ever-changing stream of systems, technology, society, consumers, and competition, which is a stream that sits within the larger stream of economic, social, and political forces. And we loved the fluidity and the concept of the tide because it was both tactile, emergent, and it represented the kind of complexity that we were familiar with and most people were dealing with. It wasn't a static backdrop that we could eyeball.
Yeah, I love the idea of rivers within oceans. So I'm going to digress and talk about a vacation I had once. Oh yeah, Carol, sure. Many years ago, a friend of mine said, hey, let's go out to the Gulf Stream. And I'm like, okay, so there we are in aqua water. And then all of a sudden you see this river of dark blue. But what surprised the heck out of me was when we got there, the boat shot up about 6 inches because the power of the stream actually made it higher. And just the whole idea of what you're talking about with those kind of fluidity. But I love the idea of when you said step into it. Can you talk a little bit about how to step into that tide?
Well, I'm going to tell a quick story too. When we were
Okay.
writing the book, the Hong Kong riots and protests were going on. And there was an interview with a protester on the BBC, and he said, well, look, whenever the police come after us, we pop up in another part of Hong Kong. And our goal is to be like water and to flow and just literally be present wherever the police are coming after us. And it was taken from a Bruce Lee quote, which is like, be like water. And that really hit us, because this concept of moving away from the activity and always being present was the kind of prompt for us to consider the tide. And of course, I'm a sailor and I kind of like the metaphor. But you know, when you think about the tide, it's been a powerful metaphor for us, because essentially you can't control it. It's a force of nature. And so the idea is that you're not going to actually either control it or force your way into it. You've got to react with it. So it's this complementary activity that a leader has to make in terms of reacting to the tide, sensing the tide, and guiding it, not mastering it. And of course, this, you know, breaks an era of you know, charismatic leadership that we're trying to escape from. There's no omnipotent leader that's going to suddenly harness the tide. This is actually an interaction with the environment that new leaders are going to have to do.
That's wonderful. So one of the people with us, Lisa Strutt from Ireland, says she loves the tidal metaphor. It resonates, especially when you live near the Atlantic coast in Ireland, where the water is just crazy. Do you want to walk us through some of the components that you talk about? Each one of these is a chapter in the book that's both research-based and practical. And for us as coaches, I think it's very applicable to how we can formulate questions and concepts that will really amplify our coaching.
Well, I mean, I think the most important concept is that we're trying to help people use agency to guide the tide in a way that delivers different types of results, which we call results beyond results. And because today's leaders need to do more than deliver the numbers, they need to deliver impacts that go well beyond the obvious. And the best leaders we've worked with have actually seen this from the very start. And we talk about three things in terms of impact. You know, we talk about you know, sustainability. You know, we talk about you know, the idea that that these are going to be these leaders actually create a talent system that they're going to want to be able to, you know, to be able to move beyond. And so we begin to think about the idea that results beyond results is an impact that sits well above the actual numbers. And so, you know, when we get beyond the numbers, we create a world where we have to step back and decide what's the process we take to take ourselves to that level of ability to step into the tide. And very quickly, we set up the book around three stages. First is honest engagement. That's a lot of the work that you and I have done, which is really about taking a deep look at yourself, your values, your purpose, and understanding how empathy works with others. It's really an insight moment, which sets you up as sort of the cornerstone to step forward. The next piece is addressing reality, removing the biases, trying to see things as they are and not as you'd like them to be, looking the way reality sets up, you know, and not the data you want to see, but the data that actually appears before you, you know, getting rid of the noise. And then the final piece of this is stepping into the tide, which is really about adaptive impact. And I talked earlier about how the tide is not necessarily something you can master. It's something, we like the word adaptive impact because you're constantly bobbing and weaving and adjusting yourself. And that really involves both stepping into the tide, but also, you know, creating a narrative in terms of ambitious realism and storytelling, which we've seen in a lot of leaders. And then finally, creating the talent and the virtuous circle that allows you to power this thing forward. And you can basically ensure that you got the success and the people marching with you into the tide with confidence.
So guys, what you should also know is that basically each sentence Jonathan said is either a chapter or a subchapter in the book. So you can double, triple, and quadruple whatever. Anyway, it's very, very deep. So Jonathan, here's a choice point. Number one, would you like to go more into finding that critical place to stand, or begin that with talking about some of the work you did with Paul Pullman that's now the case studies at Harvard Business School. Which do you want to do?
Well, let's talk a little bit more about stepping into the tide. There's one concept that I think is really useful, and it's one that you and I both found useful when we spoke, which is the concept of when you step into the tide using adaptive impact. We came up with this concept of a humble safari.
I love this.
I think it's really useful for coaches as well, because it's this willingness to step into the environment you're about to try and step into and influence by being humble, stepping beyond your own world, listening deeply, and essentially figuring out what the schema is that you want to challenge, sometimes called culture, but I think it's a little bit more sophisticated than that. And then beginning to help yourself design the story you want to tell about the organization based on those learnings. And that's something that, in the book we talk about, Satya Nadella did very well. And I also think it's something Paul Pullman did really well, to your point, which is once he went on the humble safari and really took stock of the organization. And again, you would call this Olympic level listening, Carol.
Yes.
Essentially, for a leader to do this is really humble. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to balance this paradoxical set of skills about being humble and proactive that a lot of leaders find difficult to balance. We see the proactive side of them, but we don't see the humble side of it. And so I think followers need to see both. And for this to take place, the humility in terms of a humble safari needs to take place, because you need to understand what's going on and recognize how you're going to enroll others in this inclusively. That's where the humble safari takes place. And of course, we can talk about Paul or Satya Nadella in a minute.
Yeah. But yeah, that was really fascinating. This whole idea that your organization is sort of this jungle, and you're going to go around and here's the giraffes and here's the zebras and, here's a lot of water. So the whole idea of just navigating this by, I think you talk in the book about, dynamic curiosity, not just curiosity, and curating the capabilities. There's some great concepts in the book. So we're going to pause for a moment because, wait, I saw this question come by. I think Umit, I love the metaphor. I wonder how many leaders are out there with the intention to control the tide rather than guide. Most of the time, it's not even bad intention. It's just habit and learned behavior. That shift could make a big difference in how leaders show up. And he thanks you for the ideas. Do you have a comment on his comment?
Yeah, in the book, we state several times, leadership is very much about how you show up. And I think that the reason that we have a 3-step model, in addition to many books have 3-step models, is that you have to do the work in managing your perspective and yourself before you can step into the tide and understand where your ego sits. My colleague Frank Guglielmo used to talk about, when we started to think about honest engagement, that people needed to write both their own biography and understand their autobiography, and the two needed to match.
Oh, that's a good point.
And that's sort of the understanding of humility in terms of how the world perceives you and how you show up, but also how you perceive yourself. And it kind of puts a governor on your ego as you start to align the two. And I think that for a lot of leaders, it's unless you go through the process of that level of humility, and in the book we talk about development and sort of understanding how you learn from crucibles as well. You don't really have the ability to have that humble approach to the tide. You actually believe you can master it. And I think that it's a naive thing to believe in today's complexity that you're going to be able to achieve anything, even including targets or KPIs, in the complexity we face today. And we haven't even talked about AI, for example. And the third concept, which I didn't talk about earlier in terms of adaptive impact, is something we call humanosity, which is the best leaders who are able to step in the tide are able to address and provide meaning in a world of technology and people. And that line between build by borrow bot and the employee is something that the most sensitive and really human leaders are able to do. And we call that concept humanosity. And that's going to be more and more important for these leaders as they realize that the tide and the forces behind the tide are not controllable.
Well, it really sort of speaks to what's a, pardon the pun, tsunami. Um, but the whole idea of you can't do this alone, that you really need in terms of leadership to be incredibly collective. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? I know that's what you've done in a lot of your leadership development programs that are around the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that we realized in the book and in every process that we considered in each step is that the ability to seek others' feedback, and I look at you and I see a coach, is extraordinarily important. And I think that for leaders who aren't able to seek out and get the kind of feedback they need, whether it's from the diversity of their teams, or whether it's from coaches or from other leaders, or from the organization at large in a humble safari, are not going to set themselves up for success, and they don't represent the best leaders I've seen. I mean, if you don't mind, I'll segue to the Paul Pullman example for a second here.
Yeah, great.
Paul Pullman, who ran Unilever, we both knew well, he came in as a very, very strong leader, and he was set up for success because he was a CFO of Nestle and he knew consumer products. But when he arrived, he was very humble. He respected the past. He dug into it. He took a humble safari into our past and looked at our archives and began to understand our deep mindset around Lord Lever and hand washing in the old days and what was embedded in our culture. And even though he saw a slow-moving organization, he saw the power of that heritage that he could unlock. And when he came out with his stepping forward, into the organization, his narrative around the sustainability piece reflected a deep understanding of the organization, and he realized it was something he could take people with him to do. And in some ways, he brought curiosity into it. He brought the talent challenge that I talked about into it. He brought this concept of constant sustainability, not just external sustainability, but making the organization reinforce itself into the dialogue. And it's kind of a beautiful story of how leaders can do this. And obviously, he was quite successful for a long time in doing it. And you and I were also quite successful in doing some of the introspective work and helping the leaders get the insights they needed to sign up for this and even enroll themselves in his, ambitiously realistic vision. So we were a supporting factor to it. But I think that the best leaders really are approaching this with a humility that is recognizable. I never heard people talk about Viktor Frankl before at a high level, before I met Paul. And it was in our first conversation. So I think, he wanted to set the stage for that in addition to being a almost ruthless businessman, he had a human side and he had a humble side that was going to balance him across the way. And he was definitely proactive.
So maybe you can remind me, but one of the things you talk about in the book is the power of the narrative, and there are two kinds of stories, and I forget the first kind, but the second kind was really looking to the future and how to have a narrative like so laser sharp so that it just creates the future in like a sentence. And I forget what it was he said exactly, but from the very beginning, he said he wanted to, was it double the something and half the carbon footprint? What was that again?
Yeah, he wanted to double our positive impact on society and have our carbon footprint. He wanted to make sustainability commonplace.
Yeah, and to double the profit. I mean, that's where you were saying that was so good about he was a ruthless business person and an incredible, sustainability and visionary.
And this isn't in the book, but the best leaders are able to craft statements like that enroll people in both the ambition, which is both a reach, but also the realism, because they know they can summon that energy and they're willing to go on that journey with them. And I think there was meaning behind that too, because obviously the societal impact was something that people could connect with themselves, but there were also ambitious people in the organization that didn't want to do this without the double the income because they knew that would sustain our success. And I think, I think that's the communication skills of leaders cannot be underestimated. And hopefully knowing how you communicate that's best for you is very different for each leader. But Paul did that well. And I also think he was smart enough to use the marketing function, because we were a marketing company, to to articulate our views externally as well as internally. And I think that consistency was obvious to everyone and improved our brand. We became one of the most attractive employers in the world during this period, which was completely out of the ballpark ambition for a company like Unilever. Clearly because of that ambition and that realism.
Yeah. What do you think did it? Because when I showed up, you'd been there a while. The company had been sort of not just collaborative, but like not willing to take on these authentic conversations. And then he wanted to sort of build a true performance company that also collaborated. What is your sense of what unlocked it? Because you were in the center of that.
Well, I think that a couple of things, Carol. I'd like to believe that the work we did in leadership development was a pretty big catalyst. We were pretty fortunate.
Yes.
We were pretty fortunate to do something that most companies don't do, which is most companies deliver the big P, which is that purpose statement, which says we're going to be the world's best, or we're going to, conquer this, or we're going to make the world change for this reason. But what they don't adjust is the little P, which is the one that I've got. And I think what you and I did quite successfully through really the honest engagement part of what this model looks like, which is really building the basics about values and purpose and self-awareness, is we gave leaders the little P. We helped them understand who they were, what they wanted to do with the opportunity, so that they could literally ladder up to the big P. And Paul's big insight is you can't have the larger purpose without the individual purpose. And very few leaders frankly, are willing to make the commitment to do that. And not only did we do that through learning, but he embodied it. I mean, he role modeled it. I mean, you and I sat together on numerous events where Paul would show up and get deeply emotional, talking about his own crucible and his own purpose.
Yeah.
And I remember you elbowing me constantly and saying those are real tears, because he was vulnerable in a way that they didn't see in that ruthless businessman. And that created a consistency and authenticity that frankly was quite humbling to the people in the room. And of course, from that, we got more dialogues, we got authenticity, we broke down silos, we got the ability to empower people, we trusted them more. And there were a whole bunch of different cultural shifts that took place from that transformation, from connecting the one P to the other P and basically signing up again with Paul. But you can't do that without setting it up right and reading the signals correctly and stepping into the tide correctly. And Paul did that. He knew exactly where to step in. He respected the heritage. He understood the culture. He had the consumer, society, and the stockholder deeply in mind. And he took us through it very skillfully because we trusted him, and he was successful.
Yeah, so there's one part of the stepping into the tide that I think is very kind of relevant for coaches. So there was the first one about having a new understanding through the humble safari, but a piece of that was through people challenging the group schemas and norms in order to shape it. And I think that's where coaches can be really helpful, just by saying, I think you talk about how to disrupt it and how to disrupt it with simple questions, like, be truth seekers. What are some of the things you've seen with that?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we've done very successful with coaches is exactly what you say, which is we use coaches to reframe the realities that people were sharing with us. And their ability and skill and wisdom in reframing it in a way that helped them understand the schema, pick it up and look at it, take some distance from it, as we say in the book, get in the balcony and examine it, is skillful. And then, of course, the best coaches are able to ask those questions. To guide people. And again, I've never met coaches as good as the people on our program. And I am giving you some praise here because I think some of the insights these people took away, not about the schema at Unilever, but the schema that they held in their head. I mean, most of the people who we worked with, and unfortunately, a lot of the people I've worked with in my careers are passengers in their own lives. The bar comes down on the ride, and we throw experience at them. And I used to always talk about the Aldous Huxley quote about experience is not what happens to you, but what you do with experience. We want to help people when we did this together, and I want to do this through the book, to become authors of their own narrative and do it in a way that's wise and not egotistical and caring and aware and mindful. And that level of perspective is something a coach can provide, you know, exponentially. A great coach. And the processes that we provide on programs like the ones we ran were in many ways tune-ups for that kind of perspective.
Yeah, and in a word to let people know, this was like a 4-day program. They had killer 360s that were like very confrontational and at the same time very supportive in terms of then what was done with it. But here's a question from Kim Brown. I'd love to understand in what ways you have observed leaders learn to embrace humility and even the motivation to look beyond what they want to believe. Often fear or insecurities guide leaders.
Well, I mean, we're on the topic, so I'm going to use the program design. When we wrote this book, we took a good look at much of the theories that Bill George and others and Bob Thomas wrote about crucibles. And you know, crucible is a deeply life-changing event that leaders have experienced. And one of the things we've done on our leadership programs and in this book is we talk about the best leaders are able to mine their experience in these deep moments of impact for learning. And most of the time, what comes out of it is a level of humility for the fact that the world can unfortunately be quite a dangerous place and have huge impact on you. And of the best leaders we saw, and we make this point in the book, are those that can actually step into crucibles with a deep understanding of the fact that they will arise again. Yes. And they have the skills to achieve a post-traumatic sort of bounce, as we describe it in the book. But that level of humility comes from an understanding that the world can be unfair, and that we should expect the unexpected personally, and that, you know, we're not exempt from it, but we can learn from it. And that humility was something that we specifically put leaders in front of to work through as part of their development. And, you know, frankly, the leaders that haven't gone through that self-awareness and kind of self-work are frankly a little intimidating to me, in terms of I wouldn't want to work for them because they don't have the depth of experience that I could share with them, or they could appreciate me.
Yeah, those are some of the guys I love to take on because I'm insane. Because one of the other things I remember we talked about is like, it was sort of like snowboarding, that you go deep into something and then shoot up so that you would be higher than you were before. But one of the other things I thought that was really powerful about the program that you and Nick Craig developed was that when they would share these crucible stories, so it would be like a group of 3 people sharing 3 crucible stories in a row. So for people to hear this powerful message that they weren't alone, and then they could harness those crucibles and connect them with their strengths to find deeper purpose. And it was very, very powerful. You know, I've done a lot of work since then, and I don't think I have ever experienced anything more powerful than that journey.
And one of the neat things we picked up in the book, Carol, is we went through a similar model of the one I did with Nick and others, is that we started to realize that purpose is the starting point and not the end point. And then when you develop someone who wants to go through a crucible constructively, we come up with this concept of simultaneity, which is they need to believe that I will go down, but then I can go up. And being able to hold the two, this very messy reality in place, allows them to be stronger coming through the bounce. Because it gives you optimism as opposed to it's a yay or a nay. And while it sounds a little paradoxical, this concept of simultaneity, of being able to realize that I'm going to go down, but I can go up, really helps you approach the journey in a way that great leaders can do.
Yes. And so would love a last comment, and I'll read one last statement here. Patrick, whoops, it suddenly disappeared. Sorry, Patrick, there you are. Patrick Donadio, love this, to do it in a way that help people become wise, but not egotistical. And he asked for tips on this, but too late. So Jonathan, one last comment as we say goodbye, and thank you everybody for your great questions.
Thanks, Carol. I mean, I was re-energized by the book. The book is about optimism. I think the world can be led by leaders with agency. We're seeing more and more of them, I think particularly in the next generation. And we're actually starting to build programs and events which can support this development. So thank you, Carol, for your time. Thanks everyone who joined us. And I look forward to talking to you more, Carol, anytime.
Okay, everybody, thank you very much. Remember, next Wednesday, first Wednesday of the month, high noon Eastern. So thank you, everybody, and see you next month.
Thanks, Carol.